We have an unbelievably exciting show here today at the Four Boxes Diner. We have Richard Hayes and Emily Taylor of the Armed Attorneys. I could not be more excited for this discussion today, and I hope you'll stay tuned to hear all about it. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar, and best-selling author. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so and show your love for the right to keep and bear arms. All right, folks, I'm really excited about today's show. We have Richard Hayes and Emily Taylor. I'm sure you know more about them than anybody else because they are famous Second Amendment attorneys down there in Texas. They are the stars and hosts of the Armed Attorneys YouTube channel, which, despite only being around for less than a year, has almost 6 million views. And I am proud to say that I, too, am one of their, happy subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed to the Armed Attorneys, you also have to do that, too. Emily and Richard, let me give you a little bit of background before we start our discussion with them. They are both former felony prosecutors, which means they've actually prosecuted crimes, including gun-related crimes, so they have a lot of experience in that area. Today, they are now criminal defense lawyers protecting the individual against the government and prosecutors who want to put their clients in prison and otherwise punish them. Richard and Emily are the authors of the Texas Gun Law Bible, really. That's the Texas Gun Law, Armed and Educated. So if you don't have a copy of that, you may want to pick up a copy of that real soon. And Emily and Richard, thanks for joining us here at the Four Boxes Diner. It is a great honor, and welcome aboard.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here, and we love your show as well.
Thank you. So, Emily and Richard, let's just start here. So, why did you start the YouTube channel, The Armed Attorneys, and how do you think it's been going so far?
We started it because we wanted to make life for the law-abiding gun owner just a little bit easier. We speak to so many folks who just have really simple questions that, you see people talk about on forums or you see them discussed it on Facebook, and there's just not a really good, consistent source of information out there. And so just these little tiny questions that people are left in the back of their heads, we wanted to get those questions answered, make those people's lives easier. And, it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy the YouTube channel, and I know Emily does as well. But the rest is history. We just kind of started it on a whim, didn't expect this kind of success, and it's been great.
Yeah, and it's nice too. There's not a reliable source for most people when they're, trying to find the answers to questions. Plus, it's nice to find someone who's actually a practitioner who can tell you, I know this is what the black and white of the law says. This is how it plays out. Particularly in a Texas courtroom,
yeah.
But, we can extrapolate other places. It's good.
Yeah, it's so incredibly important for anyone that's interested in the Second Amendment and gun law. You Google Second Amendment, you Google gun law, and just a voluminous amount of information comes up, both, text, blog posts, then you have YouTube videos. It's really hard to know, who to trust. And I think you're doing a great service for the Second Amendment community for trying to, teach the basic things about how do you carry a gun in a car? What should you be worried about? What do you say to the police if they pull you over? These are the practical questions that are so important, because I'm sure you know this, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, which gets right to my next question is, in your gun-related practice, how much is it really about preventing people from getting in trouble in the first place? Hey, they call you up and say, Emily, Richard, I want to do this. Can I do this? And how much of your practice is really about, hey, I've stepped on a legal landmine. I didn't mean to. Something happened. I need you to get me out of the hot water. How does that kind of work out in terms of your own practices?
Yeah, we have some really incredible outcomes with early intervention and preventative measures. We talk to about 9,000 gun owners a year on non-emergency issues, questions, hey, I want to sell my brother a gun, or hey, I'm traveling to this state, what do I do? They range from all different topics, but it's very rewarding as a practitioner to see early intervention and advice and just, have such positive outcomes. And so, that part is really rewarding to me.
Yeah, and luckily, I know for certain, it's hard to prove a negative sometimes and say, oh, I know I've kept people out of trouble. But gosh, there are times where we get the phone call and someone's like, hey, I'm driving to New Jersey right now. I've got all my guns with me. That's cool, right? And in that instance, we know we've saved someone. So we're
Right.
like, no, stop the car.
Yeah, and a lot of people think, attorneys are magicians. They can make things disappear overnight, or they're fixers, or, I just think we're basically high high-paid janitors, and it just depends on how big the mess is. And it's nice to intervene early, and it's not a big of a mess. And then sometimes they are flying back from New York and stopped in security because they forgot their handgun in their bag. It just depends on what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so important. When I was a robust full-time practicing lawyer, when I ran a law firm, I had lots of my own lawyers, and people would say, well, Mark, we don't understand. You're like a fancy lawyer there in New York City, and yet you have all these lawyers working for you and advising you. I'm like, yeah, because, the law today is so complicated that really you need specialists for everything. So even if you're a highfalutin fancy lawyer, the truth is you really need to reach out to an employment lawyer to make sure that you're dealing with your employees properly. You need to hire, pension and ERISA lawyers if you got a 401k plan to make sure you're doing that right. Every single thing in America touches on the law, and you need to understand the different intricacies. And if you get it wrong, there's real bad consequences, especially when it comes to firearm laws, which gives rise to kind of my next sort of general question is, we talk a lot on this channel, Emily and Richard, about the difference in types of crimes. I mean, you're experienced criminal lawyers. There's these crimes called Malum prohibitum crimes, which is basically the government says they're a crime because we say they're a crime, right? Hey, I'm the dad. You got to listen to me. That's really all it is, like AR bans. And then you have this malum in se type of crimes, which is, it's things that we understand in our bones as humans are immoral. They're just wrong. It's like murder and burglary and fraud and theft and assault and battery. These are just, we know there's something wrong with them, and we understand why they're illegal. But on this malum prohibitum, which seems to me most gun control laws in America are just, we don't like the length of that gun, or we don't like the color of that gun, or we don't like the characteristic of that gun, or we don't think that you should be able to carry a gun on the sidewalk in front of a school, or whatever it is. Can you talk a little bit about this difference between malum prohibitum, malum in se, and how that impacts kind of your representation of gun-related clients down there in Texas?
Yeah, particularly we see when it comes to most firearm laws, they're malum prohibitum because it is lawmakers legislating just a knee-jerk in the wake generally of some tragedy or some big public scare. We have the National Firearms Act because we were all terrified of mobsters. We have, the Gun Control Act because of high-profile public assassinations. We really see these, there is no moral component to it. It is, what I think the Founding Fathers did not want us to engage in, which is our lawmakers legislating out of fear because of some massive event that has happened in the country. Although, I will say, I can't talk about this without thinking about Legally Blonde, which is, should be a favorite movie of every female attorney. When she says, I'll take the hard one because I don't want to challenge, give me a malum prohibitum any day. I disagree fully with Elle Woods because it is way easier to defend a carry crime or a possession crime. A murder charge, not so much.
And I'll say the one additional aspect to it is very frustrating from the client's perspective to face the former type of charges because there's no root, there's no history, and there's, like you said, it's not in our bones or our framework to think this is the wrong thing to do. And part of what's making our modern society and firearms owners laws so difficult, it is very difficult to figure out what laws how our conduct is going to be judged underneath this crazy framework that we have because it's not rooted in common sense.
Right.
And so it's frustrating.
I locked my handgun in my center console and drove interstate rather than in my trunk, and now I'm in big trouble.
Right. Like there's not distinguishable, but the law, yeah, you're in big trouble maybe. So it is frustrating from a client experience.
Oh yeah.
There's an old saying in the law that even our viewers have probably heard of, which is ignorance of the law is no excuse. Now, I always thought that made sense back when we only had some laws. Everyone had an understanding that murder was wrong and whatnot, and these laws were few and far between, and they really were based in a form of human morality that people, even if they were not sophisticated lawyers, understood, hey, it's wrong to steal. Hey, it's wrong to punch someone in the head. Hey, it's wrong to kill someone. So you understood that. But today, because of the explosion of these these regulatory laws, even if they're enacted by statute, like these line drawings under the NFA, like what's a short barrel rifle, what's not, all these kinds of line drawings, they're so arbitrary and capricious that, there's no way even the best lawyers in the country, and I think you both are two of the top lawyers in America, even the best lawyers in America cannot possibly know all these laws. And to me, it's really unfair for ordinary Americans to try to follow the law when, frankly, it's almost impossible for them to know what the law is ahead of time, or even to ask a lawyer, do I even have a potential legal landmine situation here? Because there's almost no way for them to know in their gut, which I don't think was the case. But today, heaven forbid people try to figure out the law on their own, because it's impossible.
Yeah, and we have, the most law-abiding demographic. The gun community, we want to do the right thing. Having spoken to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these folks, it's not for want. It's just the government has made it so difficult.
And I think it's heartbreaking because, we've talked to tons of people who they call in, they've got all sorts of questions, and they say, I'm just not comfortable carrying because I'm too worried about breaking the law. It seems like too much. And that's really, when you strip it down, that's what the government has done now, is it has stripped good citizens of their lawful self-defense rights because they have made it too difficult to possess and carry that firearm. And that is really tragic.
And I think, Emily, that's a great point. And I think, unfortunately, for many of our politicians in the country, that component is a feature. It's not a bug. They're not unhappy that people are like, oh, I'm uncomfortable figuring out all the rules of the road because they're too complicated for me to exercise my Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. A lot of politicians are like, yeah, we want to make it as complicated and scary for middle-class Americans as we possibly can so they don't decide to exercise their Second Amendment rights. And I think that it's a great segue into, one of our substantive topics today is what the heck is going on, Emily and Richard, with these knock and talk strategies, apparently by the FBI and certain local law enforcement, where they're just appear to be showing up at law owners' homes, knocking on the door, saying, we want to talk to you, with guns on their hips here. What's going on with this knock and talk stuff? And what do you think about it?
Yeah, I would say there's a tremendous increase in the amount of harassment by ATF to regular gun owners and FFLs across the country. They've enacted a zero tolerance policy with federal firearms license dealers, gun stores. And so that's been going on for a little while, but this uptick on just private individuals living their everyday lives is something I have not seen in my practice. And it is, it's scary. There's one operation running around right now, Operation Reticent Recall, which we're going to talk about on Wednesday, where they appear to be, I don't know a better way to put it, Emily, but they're going door to door, is what they're doing.
Yeah, it's, I think I recall years ago, it was unusual. Let's say you had bought, I bought 10 Glock 19s, and that gets reported, and the ATF says, all right, Emily, let's see if you still got all 10 of those, because they're investigating something very specific, right? I want to see if you are an unlicensed seller. Every once in a while, it was so rare that, a good, otherwise law-abiding person would contact me or say, you know what, I just bought, two long guns within 5 days.
Or his and hers pistol. My wife and I just had our 50th anniversary. We got his and hers pistols.
Yeah, and they actually contacted me about this. It was very, very rare. And now, put aside reticent recall and the FRTs and the solvent traps, just sort of a run-of-the-mill contact by the ATF for something like purchasing multiple firearms within a 5-day period, that's increasing. I don't know where they're finding the resources for it, frankly.
Well, yeah. Now imagine things are not going to get any better with 87,000 new IRS agents. I know that they're not technically gun related, but they're certainly related to federal law enforcement. What's shocking to me though is as a person that respects law and order and has always tried to do the right thing, and I've always been pro-police and pro-law and order, and I've said that repeatedly on Fox News and on and on and on. But I have to say, the more the federal law enforcement does these sorts of things, they really do run the risk of hurting their credibility with ordinary law-abiding Americans. And, anyone, you're former you're former prosecutors, so you know very well the importance of having cooperating witnesses, having the community support what you do, to identify evidence, to identify, things that you might need for your trial to put people away that are bad people. But, if you have the American middle class start to ask themselves, I don't know if I can deal with these people because I don't know if I can trust the FBI or federal law enforcement, I'm not sure that's a good place for federal law enforcement to be going by basically going door to door to ordinary Americans with no criminal records. I don't know what the upside there is.
Yeah, it's a scary prospect. And I mean, there's a video I just saw posted this past weekend from Legally Armed America, something to this nature where someone, invoked their rights. I'm not going to speak to you without an attorney. I'm not going to consent to any searches. And the hostility and the threats from the government in response to someone asserting their constitutionally protected and individual rights, it's very, it's a scary thing to observe as an outsider, and to think that it's happening over and over and over again. It's unsettling.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's very intimidating for most people. And we talk a little bit about this when it comes to red flag laws. One of the concerns I have with red flag laws in particular is that, look, if you're a career criminal, right? You're in the business of committing crimes. At some point you're going to have to interact with police. They're going to show up. They're going to arrest you. It's kind of like part of your lifestyle, just the way it is. But for most Americans who have no interaction with police, they're not thinking police are going to show up. They have no idea. And if all of a sudden the police show up at 5 a.m. and they're knocking on the door, law-abiding Americans are not going to think that's the police, because they're going to like, why are the police coming to my house? We don't even understand what's going on here because we never deal with the police. And, these knock and talk things are very scary for ordinary Americans who have no interaction with law enforcement. And of course, as you know, the Miranda rights don't trigger unless you're trying to arrest someone. So it seems to me a lot of people might make mistakes and talk to the police and say the wrong thing, or they may say the right thing, but the police may write it down wrong, which also happens. So what's your sense of the kind of advice that you would give ordinary Americans if law enforcement just knocks on the door and says, we want to talk to you? What would you tell them?
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, we are just telling people at this point, just fully refuse. Either don't answer the door at all. You're under no obligation to. If you answer the door sort of not realizing what's going on, stop the conversation as soon as possible. Don't consent to anything. Don't let them inside. Get a card. They will leave you with some sort of information probably, and call your lawyer immediately. Because, it's like you mentioned, most of us, our interactions with law enforcement are twofold. It's one, you're getting a speeding ticket, which is the worst thing that happens with law enforcement with most of us. Or two, they're there to help you. You're the victim and you need something from them and they're helping you. And so for most of us, our instinct when approached is be helpful, respect authority, respect law enforcement, cooperate, make their jobs easier. And that is just simply not the case for gun owners anymore in this country. You have to completely rework your mindset, particularly as it comes to, the ATF and the FBI.
Yeah. And when speaking, it's everything in your training and experience will make you feel like you want to help and go along to get along, mm-hmm. or maybe I can expedite things by being cooperative. We're not worried about the 10 minutes on your porch or the minute on your porch. We're worried about the rest of your life. And the stakes are pretty stinking high. It's your liberty if you're implicated in a crime. So, and even offhand remarks, snarky remarks, or even things that don't seem incriminating. Hey, did you purchase a solvent trap? Do you have that anymore? No. Saying that or corroborating any type of information can be so damning, and so it's very important. I can't speak to you without an attorney. Hey, I want to help as much as I can, but I'm going to have to communicate to you through an attorney. Hey, we just have a couple of questions. Sorry, I don't answer questions without an attorney. You really have to stand your ground on these things.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think it's something probably we in the YouTube Second Amendment community really are going to have to work extra hard to spread this message. It's not a message I've thought to spread, although I've always been aware of it whenever I've been asked questions. Of course, I say don't talk to the police. That's the basic rule ever. But I never thought to have to emphasize it. But now it's pretty clear the Second Amendment community is really going to have to spread the word on this, that you just can't talk to these police. I know there's arguably some exceptions if, after a shoot, but we won't get into that right now. But yeah, I think that's very, very important to spread the word. Emily and Richard, let me ask a practical question, though. like, for example, if someone came to my house, there's no chance I would talk to them and be like, yeah, you got to, leave a card. You're going to have to leave now. I don't talk to anybody. My lawyer will get mad at me if I do. Goodbye. Have a nice day. That would be the end of it. But what happens in situations, Emily and Richard, where I'm not the one answering the door? In other words, what happens if, a teenage son answers the door? What happens if the wife and the husband that's not a gun owner, that doesn't watch, the Armed Attorneys channel? What happens if someone else answers the door and lets them in or starts talking? How do you deal with that? Because presumably somebody else living in the home would have the authority to talk to the law enforcement agent or let them in or whatever this is. How does all that play out with what we've been talking about?
Yeah, unfortunately, we see wives and teenagers that's a motion to suppress lost, unfortunately. So you really need to, just like you have an emergency preparedness plan with your family, you need to have a preparedness plan for this sort of situation because, can the people who share your home, waive your rights in this avenue? Absolutely they can. There are exceptions, very young children, we've seen, some wins there. Roommates who don't actually own the home but just live there and maybe rent from you, we've seen some wins there. Also, I would say keep some doors locked. That's another good plan of attack. Talk to your family. Keep some things behind locked doors. Make sure that you keep those keys and that it's clear that no one else can consent to enter that space because, gosh, once you've consented, just all bets are off.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway from Emily, what Emily laid out is having a plan ahead of time. I don't like it when I have a client who, gets arrested and then afterward talks to somebody in his family and says, all right, well, nobody's talking to law enforcement about that. That doesn't look very good. But if you have a plan ahead of time, hey, and the plan could be this, hey, we're not talking to the police, we have to speak to the lawyer. And I think that's actually easy to communicate even to some young folks. It's like, hey, there's this person, we can only tell them stuff, just have a plan ahead of time. I think that's what the key takeaway is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very helpful information. I'm going to get comments on this video almost certainly, and it's going to go like this. Hey, Mark, we love your channel. That's fantastic information. We're so happy that Richard and Emily showed up. Great. How do I find a good lawyer? In other words, I live in Nebraska. I live in Vermont. I live in, Oregon. I need to find, the Emily and the Richard of my state. And what do I do? How do I find a good lawyer that's going to give me and my family advice and make sure we're protected when it comes to, our gun and our gun rights? How do you recommend that people find, good representative counsel in their hometown, in their state? How do they go about doing it to make sure that their rights are protected?
Yeah, to start, where I tell a lot of folks to start is, go to your local gun clubs, your gun groups, your gun rights organizations, even maybe your local gun stores, and figure out, hey, do y'all have any referrals for lawyers that, that you recommend, that you trust? I think that's always a really good starting off point. The second one, find another lawyer. Maybe they can't help you, but if you have a lawyer that you can trust, get a referral from them. And then as always, you can shoot us an email at armedattorneys@gmail.com. If we can't point you in the right direction, we will point you to someone who can point you in the right direction because we always, it's hard to find that network out there, but they exist, I promise.
And the lists that you'll find already compiled, don't trust them. People's names wind up on those lists of like 2A friendly attorneys who sometimes the people don't even know they're on the list, the lawyers who wind up on the list, and they really don't have anything to do with the Second Amendment. But once you start getting names, just good old fashioned Googling someone, look at, have they appeared on any, on or in any news outlets talking about the Second Amendment? Do they have a website for their law firm or for their practice? If so, gun people, we like to talk about what we do.
Yeah.
So look, see if there are firearms related, information, pages, publications, blogs, narrow it down with those names first and then do your research because, anyone can hold themselves out as anything in the world, but if they can't back it up, and the internet knows everything anyway, if they can't back it up, then you need to keep looking.
And then it just goes to practical, whenever I meet with a new client and when I tell people when they go meet a lawyer, you treat it like a job interview. It's a service industry. And so knowing the right questions to ask your lawyer, hey, what's your experience with firearms? Have you ever handled a case like this? Those are really important questions. If you go and meet with a lawyer and they've never handled a firearms case, unfortunately, unfortunately, there's a huge chunk of the legal profession that is hostile to gun rights, and I can't imagine someone who hates guns doing a particularly good job fighting for your rights. So having those questions, going in, treating it like a job interview, and finding a right fit, because these things can drag on for years and years. It's really important that you find someone that you can trust, that you can communicate well with, and that you just have to have that perfect fit.
I think that's great advice. And what I often tell people is, well, ask your dentist, for example, who does he use as a dentist? Ask your doctor, who does she use as a doctor? And you can go to the one lawyer that and say, hey, if you had a problem with this, who would you call? And often the dentists know the best dentists, the doctors know the best doctors, and the lawyers know the best lawyers. So certainly reaching out to like your law firm would be a great idea, because the lawyers often know the best lawyers because of the nature of what they do. So I think that's excellent advice. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on down in Texas. Let's just start with this incredibly big win last week by the Firearms Policy Coalition, that where you had a federal judge striking down the Texas law that says, I believe, 18 to 20-year-olds were not allowed to conceal carry under the concealed carry regime down there. And the federal district court judge, rightly in my view, said that 18 to 20-year-olds are part of the people, as in the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and therefore 18 to 20-year-olds have the same Second Amendment rights as people that are over the age of 20. So what's your take down there in Texas about that decision? And do we have a feeling whether or not the state of Texas is going to appeal and continue to defend that what appears to be a pretty unconstitutional law?
Well, we're excited about the ruling, first off. But will the state of Texas appeal? Richard and I were talking about that. We think 100%, because the defendant is the head of the DPS, and Texas law enforcement is extraordinarily anti-constitutional carry, as I think many law enforcement bodies across the country are. They feel like they would rather have a licensing requirement, or, at the extreme, you have some law enforcement who say the guns belong in our hands and that's it. I don't really like your sort of every average Joe citizen running around with handguns. So yes, and Richard and I worked at the legislature quite a bit for the 21 session. We'll be back for the 23 session down here in Texas, and it was the police unions and the police lobbies who were really, really, really lobbying against any form of carry expansion, and certainly constitutional carry. That tells me the Texas DPS is going to appeal this as far as it'll go.
It's very difficult, though. They're between a rock and a hard place, because right now they have a decision that applies to Texas, because that's where the ruling was. It applied to Texas law. But, if they were to take an appeal, let's just think this through, because we're litigators, so we have to look down the chessboard. If they take the appeal, you go to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is actually a pretty good court for conservative values in the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. I think in terms of the different courts of appeals out there, the Fifth Circuit is reasonably good. And there's a very good chance that you might get a Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decision that says the exact same thing as the district court. And now that doesn't just apply to Texas, but it applies, of course, to all the other states within the Fifth Circuit. And again, let's flip the scenario a little bit. Let's assume the appeal is taken by the state of Texas, and the Fifth Circuit were to rule against the Second Amendment, and were to rule against 18 to 20-year-olds. Well, now you're setting up an opportunity for the plaintiffs in that case to seek writ of certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court, and now there's an opportunity for the United States Supreme Court to take a case involving 18 to 20-year-olds and make that the law of the land. So I'm sure that the anti-gun lobby down there in Texas is thinking long and hard about whether or not they want to take an appeal to the Fifth Circuit and risk losing in front of all the, with respect to all those states in the Fifth Circuit. And also, even if they win, they may wind up losing and finding themselves before the U.S. Supreme Court, getting spanked there. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how they may be thinking about that.
Well, I do think, realistically, now that we're talking about it, it'll be mooted before we get anywhere close, because we do have a legislative session beginning in January. We are still staunchly red in our state legislature down here. And my guess is that, even with the police lobbies, really not wanting 18 to 20-year-olds to be able to carry, that we are going to clean that up, make sure that there is something constitutional on the books. just because the legislature is going to demand it.
Yeah, you got me pumped up because it sounded like a nose-loose scenario the way that you described
here
it.
comes
yeah.
Emily.
Yeah, so...
Well, that's crazy constitutional lawyers, how we think like that sort of stuff. But, we're always like, this is going to like really blow up when they get in front of the Supreme Court, and watch when they go on block. Yeah, that's the kind of geeky things that we talk about on the Four Boxes channel. And again, you guys live it. So that's an interesting question that you say that down in Texas, a lot of members of law enforcement don't like carriage. I presume there's been no movement for law enforcement to give up their guns when they're walking the streets of Texas?
No, we just held a gun buyback in Houston for law enforcement only. I'm just kidding. No, that was not for, no, it was for everybody. But no, the way the Texas legislature works is it's very bizarre, because even when the police say we are neutral on something, that means they are very much against it behind closed doors. And so we had the sheriff. I would say only one gun group came out in favor, or one police officers association came out.
Sheriffs.
Yeah, the Texas Sheriff's Association came out in favor of Texas constitutional carry. But every single other union, every other single group, they all...
Well, and the only reason they did that is that half of they were really divided 50-50. It was the rural sheriffs who said, we need constitutional carry because we can't get out there.
Right.
We can't help people in time because of where we are. Whereas the urban sheriffs basically all said, we don't want more guns on the streets. And finally, as an organization, they said, we got to go pro on this, but it was really tough for them even then because they were split about down the middle.
Yep.
That's interesting because, every state has its own little politics. You need to know who to talk to. It's a world that I'm not familiar with at all, other than I know that it's something that I wouldn't want to do, because I think it'd be, really a pain in the butt to have to walk down the, all the legislative chambers and know who's who and who are the legislative aides that count and whose vote do you need to get. And it's not a job that I think that's a very difficult job. And for, those pro-gun lobbyists out there across America, I applaud them because they are doing the Lord's work, and it's very difficult work in my view, and very tedious. And I think a lot of people would just not want to get anywhere near it. So the fact that you have some people out there willing to do it, God bless them as far as I'm concerned. Which gets, it's interesting you say that the Texas law enforcement community, a lot of them at least, don't like carriage and these sorts of gun rights issues. And yet we saw what happened in Uvalde, Texas, where I know they all weren't responsible or anything like that, but I mean, it's certainly a bad look where you have over 300 law enforcement officers, on the scene at Uvalde, and it takes, apparently, based on the reports, over an hour before you had the psychopathic shooter confronted with an armed law enforcement agent. That does not give Americans a lot of faith in law enforcement, that when you really, really need them to be there with their guns, they're going to be showing up to protect you.
Yeah, I mean, the turn of phrase used to be, when you need help, the police, when seconds count, the police are minutes away. Well, we know it's worse than that now with what has happened there. And I mean, it's just a good reminder for everyone in the First Amendment community, or the Second Amendment community. I mean, we are our own first responders. You are responsible for your own safety. And as much as we would hope that law enforcement would step up to the challenge and put themselves in harm's way to save our lives, to preserve our lives, the Supreme Court has said that is not, they don't have a duty to do that. And so until that, the police have an absolute duty to protect us. I mean, we have to have a right to protect ourselves. And I think that's the state of things.
It's interesting that I could not agree more where you say when, seconds count, police are minutes away. That's so true, but it actually in some ways gets worse, right? It's worse than that, because here we have situations like at Uvalde, at Columbine, all these other countless examples that I'm sure, we've all talked about in different contexts, countless examples that even when the police are there, they're often not really there, meaning, they may be there in spirit, they may be outside the building, but we saw in Parkland, Florida, the police were there, but they didn't go in. We saw that at the Pulse nightclub in Florida as well. The SWAT team, set up a perimeter around the club and didn't go in for, I believe, 3 hours, as I recall. And again, even more recently in New York, you had the famous novelist Salman Rushdie, who actually had, I believe, an armed guard in the building, in the room with him when he started to give his lecture. And that was not enough to prevent him from being stabbed almost to death. Thank God he's alive, and I'm hoping he's going to recuperate fully, but he was stabbed and horribly, injured, even though you had an armed guard apparently right there in the room, but the armed guard wasn't there, close enough or wasn't able to react fast enough before the knife wielder stabbed Salman Rushdie repeatedly in the face and beyond. So even when the police are there, one wonders if that really counts. And I've actually changed my view a little bit, Emily and Richard, that really, at the end of the day, though I support police, the reality is I believe that armed citizens are more effective than armed police. And I've just recently changed my view on that because I think the armed citizen has a vested interest in the outcome. It is your life as the armed citizen that's at stake. So at the end of the day, no one cares more about your life than you and your family. And therefore, it seems to me allowing you to have a gun to protect yourself and your family, you're going to have the greatest incentive to do so, even over a heroic police officer, because at the end of the day, you worry more about yourself and your family than anybody else.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better.
So some people have talked about, what does preemption mean? Does Texas have a form of preemption law where state laws trump like local bad anti-gun laws? How does that work down there?
We do. We are lucky enough to have firearm preemption down here. There is very little that can be regulated on the local level. And it's really, I mean, it's things that don't touch our lives hardly at all.
And to the uninitiated, preemption is whenever, and here in Texas, this is how we handle it. Our state legislature has taken the authority away from cities and municipalities and counties and says, hey, y'all can't regulate these aspects of firearms, wearing, carrying, selling, licensing. We're going to do that on the state level. And the advantage of preemption is uniformity of gun laws. And so thankfully, whether you're carrying in Dallas or San Antonio or Houston, while, there may be some cultural differences, the laws are going to be the same as far as, how you can legally carry a firearm. So it makes life a little bit easier. But why it's so important is we have some states that don't have preemption, and it can be a complete minefield.
Well, San Antonio tries to not be preempted.
That is true. They do push the envelope
and
a
that's
little bit.
really an unfortunate part is, we still have situation even in Texas, where we have strong, was about to say gun laws, lack of gun laws. We have firearm preemption. We still have cities that come down and say, you know what, you can't have a loaded long gun. And so anytime we see somebody with a long gun in public, we're going to stop you. We're going to check it to see if it's loaded. If it's loaded, you're under arrest. Well, the state says they can't do that. But what happens? Well, they dismiss a case anytime anyone calls them out on that. And so then there's no real way, they get to hassle the average citizen. And the recourse is it's tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that drives it. And I think maybe you can explain. I think this is very important for our community to understand the difference between laws preempting something and being able to assert an affirmative defense in the context of a case. Maybe you guys can just talk a little bit about how preemption works versus, let's say, being able to assert affirmative defense and the pros and the cons from the point of view of the ordinary gun owner with respect to both of those approaches.
Yeah, so the preemption is some superior legislature, or maybe it's the U.S. Congress. They say, we have decided to occupy this field and nobody else can regulate in this area. It might be your state legislature, and that kind of creates the uniformity. But going to the affirmative defenses, for the most part, most of our justifications, are self-defense or defense of others or defense of properties. Those are a plea and abatement. You're saying, I did it, but I did it because I had a good reason. But what a lot of people fail to internalize is that means you could still get charged with a crime. You could still get charged with an assault. You could still get charged with murder, whatever the alleged conduct is. And then the burden shifts to you, which, doesn't feel right as, a criminal defense attorney. But then the burden shifts on you to prove this affirmative defense. And what is that, Em?
Yeah, so, affirmative defense is, it's plea and abatement. It's, yes, I did it. But this is why, much different from, let's say seeking habeas relief because you were arrested for something you believe was preempted. Plea and abatement is, I guess, sometimes great. It's great when you get the right one. We have, essentially two types of defenses down here in Texas for, let's say, self-defense. We have our, sort of general, I was defending self, property, etc., but no legal presumption. We also have cases in which you are afforded a legal presumption. You just have to prove the underlying circumstance, right? Someone kicked in my front door. Someone tried to rob me. And once that circumstance is proven to the jury, then the jury is instructed that you must be presumed reasonable in your use of deadly force. That is absolutely wonderful. That is top-notch affirmative defense. holy grail territory, love to get that. Then, of course, I mean, I absolutely despise getting a self-defense case in which you don't have a legal presumption, because then you really are, I mean, to me, it's almost more of an uphill battle than it wasn't me case, because you're having to prove to that jury, not someone was robbing me, so I shot them. You just have to believe they were robbing me, and then I'm okay, but in every single moment, in microseconds, did you act reasonably every step of the way, which of course that jury is going to say, not, well, did you act as a reason, an ordinary and prudent man would have acted as a reasonable person. They're going to say, did you act as I would have acted? And Lord knows who you get on your, I mean, all attorneys know juries are just wild animals, and you just have no idea what they're going to do or say.
And maybe you could talk just briefly about, and this is extremely important for, gun owners to understand, that jurisdictions really do matter. And I think, not to get political here, but I do think it's not a shock that a lot of the prosecutors that want to go after, like former President Trump, want to do it in the District of Columbia, where they've got the District of Columbia judges there, and your jury panel presumably is going to be like 96% Democrat, 4% Republican if you're lucky. And if I were a prosecutor looking for a conviction, and I were going to go after Donald Trump, I would want to be in the District of Columbia, because, jurisdictions really matter. We talked about this on the channel a few months ago, where you had a congressman, a Republican, NRA-rated A-rated Republican from the NRA, Jeff Fortenberry. He was convicted by a Los Angeles jury for something involving campaign finance. Now, as to why a Nebraska congressman felt the need to go to Los Angeles to fundraise and subject himself to the jurisdiction of federal prosecutors in California and to juries in California is beyond me. And of course, he was convicted, needless to say, in Los Angeles, and had to resign his seat. The point being, of course, that as a gun owner, you really need to know, where are you at any given moment in time? Because you might be in a good state, but you might be in a bad city in a good state with bad prosecutors and a bad jury that just may hate guns, or may just hate you or your politics, or who knows what. How does that play out in your practice?
Oh, I joke with people all the time. If I had to shoot someone in self-defense on the border between these two counties we live by, that I would drag the body over the border to the other county, because no, it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference in, everything from the police who respond to your scene to the prosecutor who's taking charges. I mean, we live in Houston, right? Our Harris County, there is a unwritten policy, but very much enforced, that every time a gun owner shoots someone, claims self-defense, they take it to the grand jury every time. And of course, again, all attorneys know, once you take something to the grand jury, if you want it to be indicted, it will be indicted. That's it. We have no defense attorney participation. It's completely run by the government. And from there on out, and then all the way up to the judges, which of course, are either, they're elected here in Texas, I believe most states, they're elected on party lines. They're going to be either blue or red, and then your jury panels and beyond. So it really is incredibly important. And I think, unfortunately, it makes us less safe. Am I less willing to act in Harris County than I would be in Montgomery County? Absolutely.
Yeah, and I bet I would be surprised if this trend wasn't going on around the United States, but it seems to be a trend where, the bigger a city is, the more bureaucratic it is. The way you get in trouble as a government, official is you make a tough call. And anytime especially if there's a dead body on the ground, there's an accusation of murder. I mean, making a decision to stop an investigation, to let this person say, hey, you're justified, that's a tough decision that most bureaucrats don't want on their shoulders, and so they kick the can. But what that turns into is the police kicking the can, and the prosecutors kicking a can, and a grand jury kicking a can, and then the trial prosecutors kicking the can, a judge kicking a can, and then finally you're left with a jury, and this person has had a murder charge over their head for 5 years, and their life is ruined. And maybe they're acquitted at the end of the day. And I haven't talked to a client who's been acquitted who felt like a winner. No. That your life is destroyed in a lot of these circumstances. So even if you win, you still lose.
Yeah, I think that's the case with most lawsuits. I think that's the case with any of these criminal cases. Even the winners wind up losing. I don't think that there are any winners in this. Either you lose and you go to jail, or you win, but your life has been destroyed for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, because you've been living under a dark cloud that, they may be trying to take away your freedom. And it's a terrible feeling. I've seen it over and over again, as I'm sure you have. So I really appreciate your time here, Richard and Emily. Just a few more questions. We really appreciate, we've been honored by your presence here and your sage comments. Thank you very much for that. What is your thought? There's an old saying that was attributed, and it's true, that Benjamin Franklin said at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and basically it's paraphrased this way. He says that we all must hang together or we will most assuredly hang apart. Obviously saying that if the American Revolution doesn't work out so well, the people that signed the Declaration of Independence are going to wind up hanging for treason. And I guess I use that a little bit as a metaphor of the Second Amendment community, the importance of the Second Amendment community to really hang together, to work together as a family, or these colleagues, if you will, to try to protect our rights. So even if you live in Texas, you should worry about gun rights in New York. Even if you live in California, you should worry about gun rights in Florida. What do you think about those ideas and the importance of the Second Amendment community working together all across the country to make sure our fundamental right to keep and bear arms is not infringed?
Well, I think we've seen what happens when we don't work together. Mm-hmm. There are compromises, and we've had decades and decades and decades of compromises with Second Amendment rights, especially on the federal level. And gun owners haven't, law-abiding gun owners haven't gotten anything out of this deal. Usually when you have a compromise, somebody gets something out of on both ends. And really, I think we've kind of learned that lesson that, we have to unify. And that's my observation, and that's what I hope we do going forward.
Well, and just on a practical level, too, I think you can see, you look at, Gavin Newsom get away with something, and then other really blue anti-gun governors say that's the model.
Right.
And so when something bad happens somewhere, it has an extraordinary ripple effect because people say they can get away with it.
Right.
And so that's something that has to be protected against. And again, I think the same goes when something good happens, though. So when you fight for the good, too, because look at constitutional carry. If you had asked me 2 years ago even, how widespread will constitutional carry be by 2022, I never would have told you that we're looking at, just over half the states. Never in a million years. So it works both ways, and you have to be, I think, extraordinarily vigilant as to both.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'll just ask one final question, Emily and Richard. Again, thank you so much for joining us. On my side of things, I'm more now of a kind of an academic, scholarly, geek kind of guy, doing the history of the Second Amendment, the legal analysis of the Second Amendment, writing these kind of academic articles for the university world and all that. But I've often thought that the way it works, especially in these high-end constitutional matters involving the Second Amendment and any constitutional right, you really kind of start off with scholarship that gets relied upon by the lawyers and cited by lawyers to the courts, and then the courts rely upon what the lawyers say to write their opinions. So you really do almost have like an assembly line between. And what's interesting is that the Nyserpa versus Bruin case really made this clear, because the Supreme Court said, look, going forward, we want to really understand before we uphold any gun control laws, is there a historical analog from 1791 that says that this kind of gun control law was acceptable to the founding fathers in 1791 in the 18th century? And I'm presuming that the lawyers are going to start relying more and more on history and these kinds of scholarly arguments to prove their case. And ultimately, these judges, like we saw last week in Texas, are going to rely on this history, for better or for worse, to discuss what rights we have under the right to keep and bear arms in the Second Amendment. What is your sense of the role of scholarship and history in some of the work that you do to protect our Second Amendment rights?
Well, I'll say, and going back to Bruin, I was speaking with another great lawyer out of the state of Virginia, Gilbert Ambler, and this was a disagreement we had a year ago, and he assured me, it was going to be a standard of text as informed by history and tradition. In my mind, I couldn't even wrap my head around it at the time, and now it seems like it's the only thing that makes sense. As far as how it goes going forward, I think you're 100% correct that the culture and the gun law is going to stem and flow from that academic scholarship. And so I'm very excited to see your work. And I think part of that is informing the 2A community, so we have this agreed, this is the history, agreeing on the history and pointing it out so that it becomes mainstream and widely known, so that when those issues do arise, we have something, we have all this ammunition ready to go.
And I think it's going to make good law, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's the, at least from my perspective, when I'm litigating a murder case, criminal lawyers are not scholars. However, we're going to have better laws on the books because lawmakers are going to have to look and say, does this comport with this new standard? And they have to examine the history and tradition themselves and figure it out. None of them, well, I say that, maybe some of them do want their laws in the spotlight and in the court system, but we would hope that they don't want to pass laws that infringe upon the Second Amendment and that will be determined to be unconstitutional. So it's going to be extraordinarily important.
And, it's interesting. You can now really see the effort by really the anti-gun community, the left-wingers in America, to try to discredit American history, to try not to teach it in our schools. Or if you're going to teach American history, you teach it in a very selective way, ignoring the broad history behind, for example, the Founding Fathers and the constitutional rights. And you can see kind of the strategic reasoning behind trying to teach a different type of American history than what really happened to our students and to our legal community. So I do agree that having robust, accurate, good scholarship and good history is extremely important to our entire Bill of Rights, because at the end of the day, if the institutions do not step up and protect our rights under the Bill of Rights and the entire Constitution, then we're going to be living in a much different country. And as we've seen from around the world, I'm comfortable saying that the U.S. Constitution, as it's been interpreted over the last 200 years, is the best form of government. It may not be perfect. There is no such thing as perfection in the human experience, but certainly it's the best out there. And I think that's a reason why the United States remains the greatest country that's ever existed in the world. And let's hope we maintain that standing for some time to come. So, Richard, Emily, again, thank you very much for joining us. Is there anything you'd like to say about, to my viewers here on the Second Amendment community, anything you'd like to say about the Armed Attorneys, your most excellent YouTube channel, or anything else that you feel we really need to get out there to those that care about the right to keep and bear arms?
Now, I'd say keep watching your channel. We very much enjoy it. And if you enjoyed this discussion, do come check us out over at Armed Attorneys on YouTube. But we had a great time speaking with you.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, Emily, did you have anything you'd like to add to what Richard just said?
I do not. He said it all.
Well, Richard Hayes and Emily Taylor, thank you so much again. It's been a great honor. I'm sure people are going to love digging in and listening to this. A lot of people like to listen to the videos multiple times because there's such great information. And again, for those out there, if you haven't subscribed to the Armed Attorneys website on YouTube, please do so and show your love for Richard and Emily. Richard and Emily, thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Orders up. Table 2A.